But I'll be talking about some resurfaced allegations from 2019, showing that effective altruists were tying grant funding to a signed commitment to cite specific scholars and make certain conclusions. So give me a minute here and we'll get going. Um, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a post that I published on Tuesday at Dark Markets, resurfacing some older allegations that I think did not get any traction back when they were first publicized. And so this is really just my first impressions of some statements being made by a third party that never really got any air. But I will also be going back in and I think reinvestigating this. I don't do that often because a lot of the time people have done a lot of work, and in this case, that's true too. But there's more to be done because there was really never any answers given for this particular thing. So, um, 2 seconds. I'm going to go grab a sip of water, and then we'll talk about Simon Knutsen's allegations regarding EA funding and bribery. All right, I'm back. Got my little sip. Just to keep the throat moisturized. So I'm really just going to be talking a bit today. I'm learning all of the different formats that I can do these videos in, and the quick and easy one is the vertical phone. But to get to the substance, so a few days ago, and this was actually something I discovered via Emil Torres, if you're not familiar with their work, but there were claims made back in 2019 by this guy Simon Knutsen, who is a PhD student living in Sweden. Apparently, kind of a long-term PhD student, which we'll get into some of the nuances there. Um, he was a volunteer with a branch of the effective altruist movement called, I think, the Effective Altruism Foundation, which is not one that I've actually heard that much about. But he was part of their group back early 2010, and that included working with a guy named Holden Karnofsky, who he was later quite entangled with the FTX affair. And that's kind of one of the points here is that a lot of these people, whether they're EAs or rationalists, the unethical behavior that we're about to talk about on the intellectual side very much feeds into their unethical behavior in finance, and supports it and makes it easier to get away with. Specifically, what Simon Knutsen highlights and what he saw in person in 2019 was a set of communication guidelines. And we'll get into exactly how hard these guidelines were, but it seems like they were actually much more than guidelines. But these guidelines instructed people who had received funding from effective altruist organizations to, the most scandalous part, I think, is they were guided to cite specific scholars in their work that was funded by these grants. And that included, in particular, and this is the really problematic part, the specific people who were the leaders of the grant funding organizations, most specifically including this guy, Nick Beckstead, who, I won't go into the details of exactly who he is right now because we're trying to go fast, but he's a very prominent effective altruism guy. And it's important to emphasize that in real academic granting processes, this is not how it works. You do not put requirements on who people cite in their work. Um, and according to Knutson, these requirements were binding. And in direct conversations that he had with members of these organizations, these requirements were directly tied to the ability to qualify for funding. And it's not just that they were asking people to cite specific individuals. They were actually outlining specific conclusions. And Knutson, in many places, defined or describes activity that was meant seemingly to silence people who had different conclusions. He gets into the weeds here, and this is one where I am not exactly completely at a place of understanding it in detail, what the nuances of these differences are. But broadly speaking, and there's something that I can sort of infer from this, but broadly speaking, Steve wants to interrupt. Steve and the cat. Knutson says that they were guided to only reach positive conclusions about what the future should be. That is, specifically, he says that the conclusions that they were encouraged to reach were that it would be better if there was more value in the future than less. And you can tell that that's a really weird, wonky kind of thing to say, and it is very much a dispute among philosophers and sort of people who are theorists of suffering and ethics about what the value of the future is. I've written a lot about this. The sort of pro EA stance is that if we have a trillion human beings living as simulated minds on computer servers, that is positive value for the future. That's actually a plan that we should work towards. And so you sort of start to get, I mean, I'll dig into this more deeply, but you sort of start to get the valence of what these bribes were for, which is you need to prop up our vision of a technologically advanced future where technology actually makes lives better for people. And I think right now you're starting to see in a very direct way where there could be some skepticism that technology actually makes lives better over the long term. I mean, we're really seeing some falling apart of this thesis. But for possibly as long as a decade, these effective altruism organizations, which broadly are funded by Silicon Valley billionaires who have a high incentive to promote technological advance as a path to a better society, they are getting funded to put out that perspective, and it is being done under the auspices of something that looks superficially like academic inquiry, like philosophy. They claim to be philosophers. And of course, the premise of philosophy is that you're going to pursue, and the premise of any academic work is that you're going to pursue the truth wherever it leads you. This is why funding in academia is generally no strings attached. That is the ethical way to do it. You're not supposed to be pursuing a specific goal in order to qualify for more funding. Now, we can debate the nuances, right? Like academia as it really exists, yes, you get a lot of funding from, I don't know, the equivalent would be like a cigarette manufacturer funding a health study that finds that cigarettes are good for you. This is the intellectual stature of the work that effective altruists are doing. They are apologists for an agenda who are being paid to hold a specific set of views, period. And that's why this is so, I think, striking to go back and look at this 2019 claim, because there was always this air with effective altruism that something was not quite right. They're all echoing the same line. If you've been involved in academia at all, you kind of have an experience of what real academic inquiry feels like. And this is not it. There was always something a little bit off. And so now we have, and this is why it's worth looking back at this thing that was actually, described 6 years ago. It wasn't really recognized or highlighted that much at the time, partly because we hadn't yet seen the crimes that effective altruists would go on to commit using this ethical framework. But we now have, I think, a very clear explanation for the entire thing. I think I've done some theorizing about things like why people who are lapsed Catholics, like Carolyn Ellison, the CEO of Alameda and one of the co-conspirators in the FTX fraud, why somebody like that would look to effective altruism and join that movement. And I've done a lot of theorizing about the fact that, these are people who don't have ethical frameworks. They've lost God, and they don't have a humanistic ethical framework for sure, because, a lot of them as techies don't have a great deal of insight into what it means to be human. But I think we've found a much more direct way to understand what's going on here. Yes, these people are looking for meaning. Yes, they are lonely, Yolanda. I think that's very, very true. But they are also just getting paid. They're getting paid to have these opinions and to attract other people to these opinions. To be clear, the guy who came up with, or who reported on this, Simon Newton, he was so immediately turned off by the ethical implications of this communication guidelines document that he just completely quit EA at the time. I recently exchanged emails with him. We're going to talk more, and I'm going to be doing more digging here. But he confirmed that he was never given any assurance that these grants were not tied to being signatory to this communication guidelines document. He never got any response from. He either never asked Oxford or just never got any response from them about the ethical standards that this would implicate somebody who's an actual university employee with, because Stephen, you can't do that. I'm sorry. You're going to see what's happening right here. He, he decided to get up on my desk next to delicate stuff. So he's just going to stay here for a second. But the point is, this actually was supposed to be binding on university employees who received grants from EA organizations, which means that somebody who is at Oxford, like Toby Ord, or Will McCaskill, okay, I got to lock him out. He gets too big for his britches. You can hear him going insane. Just sit in my lap, buddy. Okay, sorry. This is no longer entertaining. It's just annoying. I'm not trying to wrestle the cat forever, but sometimes it is what it is. Okay, so there are binding communication commitments on people who work for universities, and it covers things like their social media, their presentations at conferences, any public communication is subject to this requirement. And what we've heard from Knudsen is that there is an implicit threat that if you don't comply with this communication mandate, you won't get further funding. That is how they operate. It is not an intellectual movement. It is a mafia based on bribery. And this money is all coming from people like Yan Talon, the founder of Kazaa and Skype. Um, it's coming from Dustin Moskovitz, the founder of Facebook, who obviously would love us to think better things about technology and the way it's shaping the future. As opposed to Facebook, which is just sending us down a hellish rabbit hole of political nightmare. That's the reality. And so, of course, they're paying these fake intellectuals to pose as smart people and write fake research reports about how great technology is and how we're all going to live in the stars. This is all an operation. I've sort of been eating around the edges of this for a few years now, but this from Knudsen is just absolutely damning. And we are going to be doing more investigation into this. But if it is what Knudsen claims it is, it's a complete fraud. It is a financially motivated fraud where all of these people, and it's really sad, by the way. First of all, it gets me mad because I'm a real academic. I have a PhD in social science, and I've taught at various universities in various capacities. But I did not wind up having a super well funded academic career. I think there are other problems with academia, and I like having freedom, and so I've just stuck with being a journalist and writer, and luckily I've been successful in that. But I still believe in the concept of the research university, and of pure inquiry for its own sake. And what these people are doing is perverting that idea by using bribes to get people to write the stuff that they want. And then what is even worse, and what is, I think, sad, is again, we look at people like Carolyn Ellison, people who are younger in this movement. They probably have no idea, either A, that this is going on, or B, that it's not normal, right? They're coming up in this intellectual framework based on, okay, you're going to write this thing for us that is very specific. We're going to give you a grant for it, and you're going to say what we tell you to. That's the normal for them. They're coming up in this system where they have not got any norms from the university system, which over 500 years, universities have been developing these norms of academic rigor, of ethical compliance, to make sure that you are actually independently pursuing ideas that you believe in, rather than what these EAs are putting forward, which is you're going to write the thing that we tell you, and that's how you're going to live. That's normal. That is inquiry, right? For a lot of these EAs, it is, I'm going to take orders, apparently, from on high about who to cite, what ideas I believe in. My beliefs are dictated by the money that I'm getting. That is effective altruism. That is rationalism. That is the entire Silicon Valley intellectual complex. That is what it is. And I think this new, it's not new, it's old, but this resurfaced information, I don't think anybody has quite twigged exactly how serious it is. And for all we know, you look back at Nick Bostrom, right? This guy is one of the founders of the rationalist movement. He came up with the idea of paperclip maximization and gray goo that Eliza Yudkowsky then went on to elaborate and build a movement around. Bostrom, again, Emil Torres uncovered back in the 90s, made some just straight up racist comments on various newsletter lists, and then didn't really apologize for it about 5 years ago. So it seems pretty clear Nick Bostrom is just a straight up Swedish white supremacist. And there's more of the cat going on behind me. and he was removed from his post at a think tank at Oxford. But we basically have seen, and Will McCaskill got removed from the board of a few nonprofits, but we haven't seen their actual positions at Oxford threatened. And I mean, I hate to be something even adjacent to like cancel culture. You're gonna be accused of being, but this isn't about like culture, right? This is about the norms of professional inquiry that should be tied to a publicly funded university that is supposedly producing research for the public good. And it's clear that to the extent Oxford tolerates this behavior from people who are nominally on their staff, that is, to the extent that they tolerate them taking external guidance from funding organizations that are going to tell them what their conclusions are, well, I believe it should be dismissible offense if they were doing that for a cigarette company. So why is it any different if they're effectively doing that for Facebook? Because that is what this is. EA, effective altruism. And now we go into progress studies. I've been talking to Andrew Orlovsky at the Telegraph recently. He tells me this has now become progress studies. And there's another term for it in the UK that I'm forgetting, but that is the same ethics of inquiry carried forward into a different form. In the US, it's being rebranded as abundance. And ultimately, and I'll end on this note because I've just been ranting, but abundance is rebranded utilitarianism. And that is really what it all boils down to, is this idea that we don't need ethics because we know what's going to have the best effects, and we should just do that based on our belief of what the effect is going to be. And so that's the ultimate. And over the course of, I didn't come into this with like some really strong stance on ethical utilitarianism. I'm a trained philosopher, but I'm not an ethicist. I'm a sort of I would say social theorist of a more abstract sort in my philosophical background. Um, so I didn't come in thinking about utilitarianism in any specific way or another, but it has become really clear to me, and this is obviously laid out in my book, that utilitarianism is ultimately an authoritarian ideology, at least in the form that it has taken today. This is stealing the future. Utilitarianism is bad, and all of these are outgrowths of utilitarianism. And so I think I'm going to end that there. There will be more investigation into this. I have already been reaching out and starting to do some digging. I think one thing I don't quite understand and need to get caught up on is exactly how dead EA is, because they have been caught out in all of these, fake scandals. Thanks for reading the book, Peace. And we'll find out more. But I mean, this is, on the one hand, it's incredibly infuriating because these people have basically stolen academic valor and they're pretending to be intellectuals when really what they're writing is just copy. They're just writing promotional copy that looks like academic inquiry. Um, and so that's infuriating. But they're also really bad. It seems like, I mean, for one thing, they wrote all of this down because they don't even understand the basics of like conflict of interest or anything like that, which is always wild. Anyway, there will be more of these. I will be trying to schedule these out further so people aren't caught by surprise. But thanks for the 20 or so of you who joined, and we'll be cutting these up and putting clips out and all that stuff. So take care, everybody. This is a big one. This is really quite important. So if you feel inclined, by the way, to share the post, which has some information on Knudsen's claims, please do that. It's I think quite important. So take care, everyone. Thank you so much for logging on, and we'll keep going.